The wind howled through the craggy peaks of the northern Rockies, carrying with it the scent of pine and the faint tang of snow melting in hidden crevices. Deep in the heart of this rugged wilderness, where the sun barely touched the ground in the late hours of afternoon, a man moved with a quiet, deliberate purpose. He was a figure cut from the landscape itself, broad-shouldered, with hands calloused from decades of hard work and eyes sharp as flint, scanning every shadow, every rustle of leaves. His name was Gideon Cross, a man who had spent most of his life drifting between logging camps, river crossings, and the occasional dusty town. Yet, for all his wanderings, he had never truly called any place home. That was about to change. A newspaper clipping, yellowed at the edges and folded roughly in his coat pocket, had led him here. It was a curious thing, a small advertisement in the corner of a forgotten page. Abandoned cabin for sale, $1. Immediate occupancy. It had seemed like a joke at first. Who would leave a cabin out in the wilderness for a single dollar? And yet Gideon knew the world held stranger bargains than that, especially in these mountains where men came to vanish from the world. He had a hunch, a whisper of instinct that perhaps this was not merely a bargain, but a call. The trail to the cabin was little more than a faint scar across the forest floor, and Gideon felt the old thrill of solitude in every step. Branches scraped against his worn coat, and the crunch of fallen pine needles echoed beneath his boots. He carried only the essentials, a pack slung over one shoulder, a hunting rifle strapped across his back, and a small tin lantern that had seen more winters than he cared to count. The mountains had taught him to rely on what he could carry, and to trust nothing that couldn't withstand a storm dot by late afternoon. He reached the clearing where the cabin stood, half hidden beneath the overgrowth of wild ivy and birch saplings. Its roof sagged like a weary old man, shingles missing, revealing the dark, weathered wood beneath. Yet, even in its decay, there was a quiet dignity to it. Gideon stepped closer, feeling the strange pulse of energy that seemed to linger around the place. He reached out, brushing his fingers across the doorframe, expecting nothing, and yet he felt it, a subtle warmth, as if the cabin itself were waiting. Then he saw her dot at first. He thought it was a trick of the fading light, a shadow flitting past the window. But no, there she was, a woman standing in the doorway, her posture unyielding, eyes fixed on him like she had been expecting this very moment. She was tall and strong, her presence commanding in a way that even the mountains seemed to respect. Her hair, the color of autumn wheat, caught the last rays of sunlight, and her gaze met his with an intensity that made him pause mid-step. "You've come," she said, her voice low but firm, carrying a weight that made the air feel heavier around them. Gideon's hand instinctively rested on the rifle at his back, but he didn't raise it. There was no hostility in her stance, only a certainty that made him uneasy. It was as if she had been guarding this place for a lifetime, waiting for a man who might never arrive, yet somehow knowing that he would. "I didn't know anyone lived here," Gideon replied cautiously, his voice rough from years of speaking only to the wind. She tilted her head, studying him with an expression that was part curiosity, part challenge. "No one else would matter. Only you." The words settled over him like a strange wind, cold and heavy, carrying an echo of something he couldn't quite name. Gideon had seen many things in these mountains, wolves stalking the ridges, storms that could strip the bark from trees, men who had vanished without a trace, but he had never encountered a mystery like this. A woman, alone, waiting for him in a cabin that no one wanted. He stepped closer, the uneven ground making his boots slip against hidden stones. The cabin smelled of cedar and old smoke, of rain-soaked wood and memories that clung stubbornly to the walls. Dust motes danced in the fading light, and he could see the remnants of life: a broken chair, a faded quilt draped over a table, a small pot of herbs near the hearth. Yet there was no sign of recent activity, no footprints in the mud outside, no smoke curling from the chimney. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Though the mountains swallowed it like a secret, she didn't answer immediately. Instead, she moved aside, gesturing for him to enter. "You will understand soon enough," she said. Her eyes, sharp and unwavering, followed his every move. "But first you must see." The cabin was larger than it appeared from outside, built with a care that spoke of someone who valued craft over convenience. The walls were lined with shelves, each filled with jars of preserved food, bundles of dried herbs, and tools neatly arranged. Gideon noted the meticulous order, the careful placement of everything, as if the room itself were alive and breathing under her watchful care. She led him to a small table in the center of the room. On it lay a bundle wrapped in rough linen, tied with a simple cord. Gideon's instincts screamed that this was no ordinary object, and when he looked at her, he saw the faintest flicker of anticipation. "Open it," she said. Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the calm authority she had held so far. Gideon's fingers hesitated on the cord. The air felt charged, the silence between them heavy with unspoken truths. There was something in the way she watched him, something that suggested the story of this cabin, of this wilderness. And of this moment was far deeper than he could imagine. When he finally lifted the linen, he found an old, worn journal. Its leather cover was cracked and soft from age, the pages yellowed and curling at the edges. He ran his thumb across the faded ink and felt a shiver run down his spine. The writing was precise, careful, and the words spoke of a life intertwined with the mountains, of secrets kept and promises made, of waiting and watching for a man who might appear at any moment. "Why me?" Gideon asked again, the question heavier this time, laden with a curiosity he couldn't suppress. She stepped closer, her eyes locking with his. "Because you are the one who can finish what was started," she said. Her tone was soft now, but it carried a weight that made Gideon's chest tighten. "And because I have waited a long time for someone like you." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin and shaking the trees. The sun dipped behind the peaks, leaving only the pale light of twilight to filter through the windows. Gideon felt a sudden urgency, a sense that the moment had arrived and yet was slipping away just as quickly. He didn't know what awaited him in this cabin, in this wilderness, or in the life that the woman seemed determined to share with him. But he knew, with a certainty that was both thrilling and terrifying, that he could never turn back. The mountains around them were silent now, save for the rustle of the pines and the distant cry of a hawk. The air smelled of rain and earth, of old wood and something more, something ancient, patient, and unyielding. Gideon looked at the woman again, and in her eyes he saw the reflection of every trail he had ever walked, every storm he had survived, and every lonely night he had endured. And he realized that whatever story had brought him here, it was only just beginning. The cabin seemed to breathe around them, its walls holding secrets that had waited decades to be revealed. Gideon lifted the journal, his hands steady now, and felt the weight of destiny pressing down like the mountains themselves. The woman's gaze never wavered, and for the first time in his life, he felt the strange pull of a future he could neither predict nor resist. Something was coming. He didn't know what, and the cabin, silent and watchful, didn't tell. But he knew he could feel it in every fiber of his being, a story waiting to unfold. A life ready to be rewritten, and a truth that had waited for him longer than he could imagine. And as the first stars began to pierce the twilight sky, Gideon realized he had crossed the threshold of something far greater than a simple, abandoned cabin. The wind whispered again through the pines, and the woman stepped closer, a hand brushing against the journal as if to claim it, or perhaps to seal it. Gideon's pulse quickened. He had no idea what lay ahead, only that the mountains, the cabin, and the woman had chosen him for a purpose he had yet to understand. And somewhere deep in the shadows of the timber and stone, something watched, waiting, and perhaps deciding the fate of the man who had come for a cabin for $1, and found a story that had been waiting for him all along. Gideon set the journal down on the table and ran a hand over the rough surface of the wood, feeling the grooves and scratches that time had left behind. The woman watched him carefully, her posture still firm, yet there was a subtle shift in her eyes, a flicker of relief, maybe even hope. She finally spoke, her voice steady but low. "My name is Marin Blackthorn. I have waited years for someone strong enough to find this place, someone who can understand what it holds." Gideon studied her, noting the way her shoulders carried both strength and the weight of solitude. "Why here? Why this cabin?" he asked. His words felt clumsy in the silence of the mountains, but he had to know. Maren gestured toward the walls, her hands sweeping over the shelves of jars, bundles of herbs, and faded photographs. Because this cabin has always been more than wood and stone. It holds memories, and it waits for the right person to awaken them. My family built it long before I was born. There are secrets buried in these wall stories that need a witness, someone who can keep them alive. The mention of family sent a ripple through Gideon's mind. He had known cabins that were abandoned because families had vanished or men had left them to rot. But this one, it felt alive, almost conscious, as though it had been waiting for him just as Maren had. "What kind of secrets?" he asked cautiously, his eyes drifting to the small bundle of linen still on the table. Maren's gaze hardened, a shadow passing over her face. "Not all secrets are safe to speak aloud. Some must be discovered in time. Some truths can't be forced." Her voice carried a warning, but also a promise, and Gideon sensed that she believed in what she was saying. Truly believed. He took a step closer to the window, looking out at the darkening mountains, letting the silence settle around them. The wind picked up again, carrying with it a faint scent of smoke and pine, mingling with something unfamiliar, something almost metallic. Gideon squinted into the twilight, thinking he saw a movement among the trees, but when he blinked, it was gone. Still, he felt the prickling of eyes on him, as though the wilderness itself were watching. Waiting to see what he would do next, Maren stepped beside him, her hand brushing against his arm, not in comfort but as a tether. "This place has drawn people before," she said softly. "Men and women who tried to uncover what should have remained hidden. Most never returned. Some came close, but they didn't understand. You might have the patience for it." Gideon turned to her, frowning. "What are you saying? That this cabin, it's dangerous?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she moved to the hearth and lifted a small iron kettle, shaking it slightly. The clinking of something inside drew his attention. When she set it back down, she opened the lid, revealing a collection of small, carved stones, each marked with strange symbols. "These are remnants of what came before," she said quietly. "People left their marks here, hoping someone would continue their work, someone who could carry their story forward. This cabin, it remembers them, and it tests those who enter." Gideon felt a chill run down his spine. He had wandered enough of the wilderness to know that some places were not meant for casual exploration, that the earth itself could hold grudges, memories, and warnings. He had never encountered anything quite like this, though, an abandoned cabin that seemed alive, waiting with intent. "Why me?" he asked again, his voice barely a whisper. The question had been lodged in his mind since the moment he had seen her. Maren's eyes softened, and she finally allowed a faint smile to touch her lips. "Because the mountains brought you here, and because you have the strength to face what comes next. I have waited for decades, Gideon. Not in hope, not in despair, but in certainty. I knew that one day you would come." He shook his head slightly, struggling to process her words. "I don't understand. How could you know?" "I can't explain it in words," she said, her gaze drifting to the window as if watching something beyond the horizon. "It's in the bloodlines, in the mountains themselves. Some people are drawn to certain places, and some places only reveal themselves to those who belong. This cabin, it has been waiting for you." Gideon felt the weight of her words settle over him, pressing into his chest. He had lived his life on instinct, trusting his hands, his eyes, and his judgment. But this felt different. It felt as though the land, the cabin, and Maren herself had conspired to bring him to this moment. He looked around the cabin again, taking in the shelves, the quilt, the herbs, the strange bundle of linen. Something about the simplicity of the room contrasted with the sense of urgency that pulsed through it. It was as if the cabin were holding its breath, waiting for him to decide what to do next. Maren's voice broke through his thoughts. "There is a room upstairs. You should see it. It is where the past speaks loudest." Gideon hesitated at the foot of the narrow staircase. The wood creaked under his weight, each step sounding louder than it should have. At the top, the room opened into a small loft, barely more than an attic. The air was heavy with dust and the faint scent of old pine. Against the far wall he saw a large chest, its surface scarred and worn. Symbols similar to the stones on the table were etched along its edges, faded but unmistakable. Maren followed him, standing silently at the doorway. "Everything you need to understand is in there," she said. "But you must be careful. Some things, once seen, cannot be unseen. Some truths change the way you see the world." Gideon's hand hovered over the chest. He felt the strange hum of anticipation, the weight of decades pressing against the hinges. He could hear Maren's quiet breathing behind him, steady and calm, yet beneath it he sensed the tension that had been building in her for years. Finally, he opened the chest. Inside were old maps, journals, and a collection of objects, some practical, some inexplicable. Among them was a small, intricately carved box. When he lifted it, he felt the strange vibration of energy running through it, as though the cabin itself were alive and reacting to his touch. Maren stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It begins here," she said. "This is what I have been waiting for. This is why the cabin brought you." Gideon looked at her, seeing both determination and vulnerability in her expression. He had faced danger before, but never like this, not in the form of a living story. A place that seemed conscious, a woman who had waited decades for him without faltering. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and for a moment the cabin seemed to pulse with life. He felt it deep in his bones, the pull of something beyond understanding, something ancient and patient. He realized that stepping into the cabin had not been a simple act of buying property. It had been a choice to step into a story larger than himself. Maren's eyes never left his. "Once you take this journey, there is no turning back," she said softly. "You will learn why this cabin has waited, why I have waited, and why you were chosen. But you must move carefully. The mountains do not forgive carelessness." Gideon nodded, feeling a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. He had wandered the wilderness alone for years, facing storms, wolves, and the harshness of the world. But nothing had prepared him for this: a cabin that remembered, a woman who had waited, and a past that refused to remain buried. As he lifted the carved box from the chest, the wind outside seemed to shift, carrying a whisper of voices long gone, a faint echo of stories untold. Gideon knew that this was only the beginning. The mountains were silent once more, but their quiet was heavy, filled with expectation and the promise of challenges he could not yet imagine. Maren stepped closer, her hand brushing against his again. "The cabin is more than shelter. It is a living memory. And now, Gideon, you are part of it." The shadows in the loft deepened, and Gideon felt the weight of destiny settle over him. He had no idea what the carved box held, or what the next days would bring. But he knew that the cabin, the woman, and the mountains themselves had chosen him. And whatever lay ahead, he would face it, because some stories demanded courage, patience, and faith beyond understanding. Outside, the first stars appeared, piercing the twilight with cold light. And somewhere, hidden in the forest beyond the clearing, something watched the cabin, silent, waiting, judging. Gideon could feel its presence even through the walls. And as the wind carried the faint sound of movement across the clearing, he realized that nothing about this place was ordinary. The cabin had secrets. The woman had secrets. And Gideon. He had just arrived at the beginning of a story that would test everything he thought he knew about the world. About trust and about destiny, the mountains seemed to lean closer, as if curious to see what he would do next. And Gideon, carrying the carved box, took a deep breath, ready to step further into a mystery that had been waiting for decades. Gideon carried the carved box down the narrow stairs, each step creaking under his weight, echoing through the cabin like a warning. Maren followed silently, her gaze flicking toward the shadows in the corners as if expecting them to move. Outside, the mountains had grown darker, the wind whipping through the trees with a sudden ferocity, rattling the cabin like it might tear it from the earth. Gideon felt the pulse of the place, a strange rhythm that seemed to match his own heartbeat. He had survived blizzards and storms, wolves and treacherous cliffs. But something about this cabin made his stomach tighten in a way no danger had before. When they reached the table where the journal still lay, Marin motioned for him to set the box down. "It's more than an object," she said softly, almost reverently. "It holds the first layer of what you need to understand. Every symbol carved into it, every contour. It speaks of the past and what is to come." Gideon ran his fingers over the smooth wood, feeling a strange warmth radiate from it, as though it had been waiting for him to touch it. "And the people in the journals?" he asked, glancing at the scattered papers. "Who are they?" "They were guardians like I am," Marin explained, her eyes tracing the lines of the maps on the table. "Each generation leaves markers, objects, or writings in the cabin. They protect something older than the mountains themselves. Some come here and fail. Some leave too soon. The cabin, it decides who can continue." Gideon frowned, the shadows of uncertainty creeping over him. He had always relied on his instincts, but instincts told him one thing and the pulse of the cabin another. The carved box felt heavier now, not in weight but in significance. He could sense that whatever was contained within would change the course of everything if he were ready. Marin's gaze shifted to the small window, where twilight was giving way to night. "You'll see why the cabin brought you soon," she said, her voice low. "But first, you need to understand the patterns." "What patterns?" Gideon asked, leaning closer to the maps, which were spread across the table in meticulous disorder. Trails were marked in charcoal, small symbols noted at intersections of streams and ridges, and strange lines that he couldn't quite read formed a network across the mountains. It looked chaotic at first, but a strange logic threaded through it. "These aren't just maps," Marin said, her fingers tracing one of the lines. "They're guides, but not for navigation. They mark events, people, and connections. The cabin holds them all together." Gideon's eyes narrowed. "Events? Connections?" Marin hesitated, her jaw tightening. "The cabin remembers those who passed through these mountains. Those who failed, those who succeeded, and those who were taken," her voice dropped. "Not by men, not by storms, but by something older, something alive within these woods." Gideon felt the wind shift outside, as though the mountains themselves had turned to listen. He swallowed hard. He had faced nature in its rawest forms before, but the weight of something unseen, deliberate, and possibly sentient pressed in around him. "Taken?" He echoed. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes the mountains call people and they vanish. The cabin has records, fragments left behind for the next to see. You are the next." He stepped back, uneasy but also captivated. "Why me?" he asked again, though he knew the answer might not be simple. Marin's face was calm, but her eyes held something he could not place in urgency that pulled at him. "Because you have walked paths most cannot," she said. "You've survived the wilds, the storms, the solitude. You can read the land, listen to it, and survive what comes. And because I have waited long enough for the right person, someone with the strength to face the cabin's truth." Gideon's hand lingered over the carved box. He could feel the faint hum again, like a heartbeat beneath his fingertips. He opened it slowly, revealing an intricate set of tools, small knives, a compass that bore unusual markings, and a crystal that seemed to catch the moonlight even in the dim cabin. Each item seemed deliberate, purposeful. Marin leaned closer. "Each tool has a role. They are not ordinary. They will guide you, protect you, and test you. But they cannot decide for you. You must be willing to take the risks." The wind rattled the cabin once more, and a faint sound reached them from the trees outside, something deliberate, moving closer but staying just beyond sight. Gideon's instincts told him to step outside, rifle ready, but the pull of the cabin anchored him inside. The carved box felt heavier, as though it demanded his attention, and he realized that whatever was out there, whatever had been watching, it was waiting for him to act first. Marin's voice broke his thoughts. "There is more to the story than the cabin or even me. There is a network, a line of guardians stretching back decades. They left messages, warnings, and objects, but the line is breaking. That is why the cabin called you. You are the one who can restore it. Or fail entirely. Gideon's mind raced. A network? Guardians? Messages left over decades? His life had been one of wandering, never settling, never expecting anything but solitude. And now he was being asked to take part in something vast. Unseen and dangerous, he looked to Maran, seeing the weight of her years in the mountains, the loneliness and determination that had shaped her into a keeper of this strange legacy. What happens if I fail? He asked, the question tight in his chest. Marin's gaze darkened. Then the cabin will continue to wait. Others will come and some will vanish. The network will fray further, and the mountains will reclaim the story. But I have faith in you. That is why you are here. Gideon leaned back, exhaling slowly. The tension in the cabin was almost tangible, a living force pressing in from all sides. The maps, the carved box, the journal, all threads of a story he could barely begin to understand. And yet there was a pull, a sense that this was where he was meant to be, at the edge of something larger than any mountain he had ever climbed. Marin's eyes shifted toward the far corner, where a narrow staircase led downward into darkness. There is more, she said quietly. A cellar beneath the cabin, older than the cabin itself. That is where the heart of it waits. You will see why the cabin chose you there. But the descent is not without risk. Once you step inside, there is no turning back until you uncover its secrets. Gideon's pulse quickened. He had faced wild rivers, treacherous cliffs, and blizzards that could strip skin from bone. But the thought of descending into a hidden cellar, alone with the weight of history and the presence of something unknown, made him hesitate. The wind howled outside again, rattling the cabin like a living thing, and he felt that whatever was waiting in the cellar could sense him, could feel his approach. Marin placed a steadying hand on his arm. You are ready, she said. But remember the cabin watches. Every choice you make, every hesitation, every step, none of it is wasted. And some of it will change you forever. Gideon looked at her, then at the carved box in his hands. The items inside seemed almost to hum in response to the cellar below, as if guiding him. He felt the pull of destiny once more, a force he could neither ignore nor resist. He had entered the cabin seeking shelter, a simple place to call his own. But what awaited him was far more than wood and stone. Outside, the night deepened, the mountains silhouetted against a sky full of stars. Somewhere in the forest, a movement shifted, subtle but deliberate, like a predator watching its prey. Gideon could feel it, and it made his skin crawl, but also sharpened his senses. Whatever the cabin held, whatever Marin had been waiting for, it demanded courage and clarity. He stood in the center of the cabin, feeling the weight of the carved box, the journal, the maps, and the quiet intensity of Marin beside him. He knew that the descent into the cellar would mark the beginning of the real test. The mountains, the cabin, and the woman who had waited decades for him all held their breath. And somewhere, hidden in the shadows outside the clearing, something waited for him to make his first move. Gideon swallowed hard. He had no idea what he would find in the cellar, what secrets the cabin truly held, or what dangers lay beyond the walls of the timber-bird structure. But he knew that stepping back was no longer an option. The mountains had called. The cabin had chosen. And the story was only beginning. He took a deep breath, gripping the carved box tightly, and turned toward the narrow staircase leading into darkness. Marin followed closely, silent and vigilant. The wind continued to howl through the pines, the shadows deepened, and the mountains seemed to lean closer, as if urging him onward. The cabin's secrets waited, and Gideon was about to meet them. Gideon's boots barely made a sound as he stepped toward the narrow staircase leading to the cellar. The carved box felt impossibly heavy in his hands, though he knew it carried the tools he would need. The cabin around him seemed to pulse with a quiet intensity, as if it too were aware of the descent he was about to make. Marin followed closely behind, her eyes fixed on him, calm and unwavering. But the tension in her shoulders betrayed the stakes. The stairs were steep and uneven, each step worn by decades of feet that had long since vanished. The air grew colder as they descended, carrying a faint metallic tang and the scent of damp earth. Gideon's fingers brushed against the rough stone walls, and he felt a subtle vibration under his touch, like the heartbeat of the mountain itself. Somewhere deep in the shadows, he thought he heard a whisper, though the sound could have been nothing more than the wind curling through the roots and rocks. Beneath the cabin at the bottom, the cellar opened into a small circular chamber. Its walls were lined with shelves carved into the stone, holding objects that defied explanation. Small figurines of carved wood, jars filled with powders that glowed faintly, and papers with symbols and notes in unfamiliar script. The faint glow of the crystal in Gideon's hand cast shadows across the walls. Making the objects seem alive, Maren stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tension. Everything here has a purpose. Each item tells a story, each symbol marks a path. You will need to understand them. Quickly. Gideon nodded, though his mind raced. He felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him, the stories of those who had come before, and the knowledge that one wrong move could unravel everything. He carefully set the carved box on a stone pedestal in the center of the room, and the items inside seemed to respond, faintly vibrating as though acknowledging his presence. This place, Gideon whispered almost to himself, it's alive. Maren's gaze didn't leave the shelves. Not alive, but aware. It remembers everything, and it tests anyone who enters. You must pay attention to the patterns. The smallest detail matters. He stepped closer to a table covered in papers and maps. Symbols and lines formed a network that he could barely comprehend. Yet as he studied them, a pattern began to emerge, a trail of connections between people, events, and locations. It was as if the mountains themselves had left a map of experiences, a legacy for the one strong enough to read it. Suddenly, a low rumble vibrated through the chamber, making the stone beneath his boots tremble. Gideon looked at Maren, alarm flashing in his eyes. She didn't move, only gestured for him to remain calm. It tests you, she said softly. Do not panic, focus. The air grew colder still, and the faint glow of the crystal brightened, casting long, moving shadows along the walls. The objects on the shelves seemed to shift subtly, though Gideon could not tell if it was imagination or something more. He took a deep breath, trying to center himself, but the weight of expectation pressed on him like a living thing. Maren stepped closer, placing her hand briefly on his shoulder. The cabin will ask questions, Gideon. It will force you to confront fears you didn't know you had. Some of what you will see may frighten you. Some may tempt you. Stay focused. He nodded again, though his pulse raced. He had faced storms, wolves, and life-threatening trails. Yet nothing had prepared him for this, the sense of being watched, judged, and tested by a place that seemed both ancient and intelligent. Then the first test came. A soft glow appeared at the far end of the chamber, forming the shape of a door in the stone wall, though there had been none before. Gideon felt a chill crawl over his spine. The door pulsed faintly, like it had a heartbeat. Maren's eyes were fixed on it. It shows the path forward, she said. But you must choose carefully. Not everything revealed is truth. Some are traps, illusions meant to test resolve. Gideon approached slowly, every step deliberate. As he neared, the door shimmered and shifted, revealing fleeting images, faces he recognized from the journal, landscapes he had only glimpsed in maps, moments from his own past that seemed impossibly clear. A chill ran through him. The cabin was reaching into his memory, pulling fragments of his life into the present to see how he would respond. Maren's voice was steady beside him. It will show you everything that binds the cabin and its guardians. But focus only on the signs that matter, the rest. Ignore. He closed his eyes for a moment, forcing himself to breathe, and then opened them again. The images on the door shifted, showing a trail of symbols identical to those on the maps and stones. It felt like a puzzle, one that had waited for him to arrive, and he sensed that failure to solve it could be dangerous. Take the tools from the box, Maren instructed. They will help you navigate what is coming. Use them wisely. The cabin will not forgive recklessness. Gideon reached into the box, taking the compass, the knives, and the crystal. Each felt alive in his hands, resonating with the pulse of the chamber. He turned the compass, and the needle spun wildly before settling on a direction toward the glowing door. The crystal in his other hand vibrated in rhythm with the compass, confirming that he was on the right path. As he stepped closer, the air thickened and the shadows seemed to move independently, closing in and retreating, testing his focus and courage. Images flickered across the walls: wolves, storms, men lost to the mountains. Gideon's mind tried to push back, but the chamber forced him to confront each fear. Each moment of hesitation he had ever known. Maren whispered from behind him, "Remember, Gideon, the cabin tests the heart as much as the mind. Courage is more than strength. Patience is more than waiting. Trust yourself, and trust the process." He nodded, swallowing hard. The door shimmered again, forming a new image, a scene he recognized from his childhood, a moment of loss and loneliness that had shaped the man he had become. A pang of sorrow gripped him, but he forced himself to focus on the symbols, the patterns, the instructions hidden in plain sight. As he deciphered the first set of markings, a low rumble returned, this time stronger, resonating through the stone chamber. Dust fell from the ceiling and shadows grew darker and sharper. Gideon felt as if the chamber itself were breathing around him, testing every instinct, every decision. Maren stepped closer, her hand hovering near his, offering support without touching. "The next stage is coming," she said. "You may feel fear, doubt, even the pull to turn back. Do not yield. Not now." The crystal in his hand pulsed brighter, illuminating a path across the stone floor lined with symbols. Gideon took the first step, then the next, each movement deliberate, careful. The shadows seemed to shift, coalescing into shapes that mimicked threats he had faced in the wilderness: wolves with glowing eyes, falling trees, cliffs that vanished beneath his feet. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet he pressed on. Guided by the symbols and Maran's quiet encouragement, the glowing door ahead shifted again, showing a figure, an older man with a weathered face and eyes sharp as mountains. The journal had mentioned him, a guardian of the cabin long gone. The figure raised a hand in silent warning. Gideon felt the weight of generations pressing on him. The legacy of guardians who had come before. Maran's voice cut through his thoughts. "He is testing your resolve. Do not hesitate. Step forward and claim the path. You are ready." Gideon took a deep breath, gripping the tools tightly. The chamber seemed to pulse faster, the shadows converging, the wind from above rattling the ceiling. He felt the presence of something ancient, powerful and unseen, an entity tied to the cabin. Waiting for him to prove himself worthy, he stepped toward the glowing door, feeling the pulse of the crystal and the compass guide him. The shadows shifted violently, forming shapes of the men and women who had failed before. Whispers rose from the walls, echoing in his mind, testing his courage, questioning his strength. Each step felt like a battle against the cabin itself, against the weight of history, against every fear he had ever known. Maren's hand brushed against his arm. "Almost there," she said softly. "The climax is near. Trust yourself. Trust the cabin." Gideon's pulse raced. He felt the presence outside the chamber, something watching from the forest, sensing his every move. The shadows reached out, the symbols on the floor glowed brighter, and the glowing door expanded, revealing a space beyond that promised revelation. And danger! He took one last step toward it, his heart pounding, the carved box and its tools in his hands, Maren by his side, and the mountains outside silent but expectant. He had faced storms, wolves, and isolation, but nothing had demanded every fiber of his being the way this cabin did now. The chamber seemed to inhale, and the shadows coalesced into a single, massive presence, its intent unclear, its power undeniable. Gideon's breath caught. Every instinct, every lesson from the wilderness, every ounce of courage he possessed was required. The glowing door waited, the crystal pulsed, and Maren's eyes held a steady, unwavering trust. And then, as he stepped forward, the final test of courage, focus, and heart loomed before him. The cabin had not yet revealed its full secret. The mountains waited. the legacy of guardians pressed down, and Gideon realized that this moment, the threshold of discovery, danger, and destiny would define everything that came next. Gideon felt the pulse of the chamber beneath his feet, the weight of centuries pressing against him, yet he moved forward. The glowing door expanded, revealing a narrow corridor lined with carvings and symbols he had seen in the journal, on the maps, and in the stone shelves below. Every mark seemed to hum in resonance with the crystal in his hand, guiding him deeper, urging him onward. Marin stayed close, her presence steady, her hand brushing briefly against his shoulder as if to remind him he was not alone. The air grew warmer as they advanced, carrying the faint scent of pine and something older, something alive in the stones themselves. Shadows no longer twisted threateningly. Instead, they shifted to reveal shapes of the guardians who had come before him. Their faces were lined with determination, caution, and a quiet hope. Gideon felt a strange connection to them, as though their courage and mistakes were flowing into him, lending strength to his own resolve. At the end of the corridor, the chamber opened into a vast circular space, lit by the soft glow of embedded crystals in the stone walls. In the center lay an altar carved from a single block of granite, polished and worn smooth from countless hands. The carved box Gideon had carried felt warm in his grip, as if urging him to place it on the altar. Marin stepped aside, her eyes fixed on him. Encouraging but not interfering, Gideon placed the box carefully on the granite, and immediately the chamber seemed to awaken. A low hum rose from the walls, the air shimmering as if filled with unseen energy. The symbols across the floor glowed brightly, casting a pattern that linked the altar, the box, and the surrounding walls into a single network of light. He felt the pulse of the cabin, the heartbeat of the mountains, and something ancient within the stones, an understanding that this place had always been more than a shelter, more than a home. It was a keeper of stories, a guardian of legacy. Marin stepped closer to the altar. "It has accepted you," she said quietly, awe in her voice. "You are the first in decades to awaken it fully. You've proven courage, patience, and understanding. The cabin recognizes strength and the willingness to protect what matters." Gideon looked down at the box, then around the chamber, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders even as a new awareness settled in. The carvings on the walls began to shift, forming images of the mountains, the forests, and the rivers in perfect detail. He could see the paths of those who had walked here before, their successes and failures etched into stone and memory. The chamber seemed to whisper, not in words but in understanding, showing him how each guardian had shaped the legacy he now shared. He turned to Marin, his voice steady but filled with wonder. "So this, all of it? It's a record? A guide? A living memory of everyone who's protected this place?" Marin nodded. "Yes, and now you are part of it. You carry the responsibility, but also the knowledge. The cabin will reveal more as you live here, as you continue to understand it. And one day, someone else will come and you will be their guide." Gideon let the weight of her words sink in. He realized that this was what had drawn him to the cabin in the first place, not the dollar price, not the isolation, but the promise of purpose. He had wandered the wilderness for years, seeking something he could never name. And here it was waiting for him, alive in stone, wood, and air. A sudden warmth filled the chamber as the crystal in his hand pulsed one last time, then settled into a soft glow. The carved box opened slightly on its own, revealing a single sheet of parchment, neatly inscribed. Gideon picked it up carefully, reading the words, a welcome, instructions for care and encouragement. It spoke of vigilance, of honor, and of the understanding that the cabin was more than stone and timber. It was a living testament to courage and resilience. Marin's voice broke the silence. "You've done it. You've unlocked what others could not. And now, Gideon, you understand why I waited." He turned to her, seeing the relief and pride in her eyes. She had guarded the cabin for decades, protecting its secrets, living in solitude, all for the hope that someone worthy would come. And he had arrived. The thought filled him with a warmth he had not known in years. He had found a home, a purpose, and a companion in the woman who had waited patiently for him. The wind outside softened. no longer howling but whispering gently through the pines. The mountains seemed calm, approving, as if acknowledging that the cabin was once again protected and understood. Gideon and Maren stepped outside together, taking in the sweeping view of the valley below, the forest stretching endlessly, and the peaks catching the last light of the sun. Maren reached for his hand, a simple gesture that carried decades of longing, patience, and hope. "We can rebuild what was lost," she said softly. "Not just the cabin, but the network of guardians. You and I can make sure the legacy continues." Gideon squeezed her hand. "We'll do it together," he said, feeling a sense of belonging he had never known. The mountains, the cabin, and Maren herself had offered him a story larger than his own, a purpose that was as enduring as the peaks around them. As night settled over the mountains, the cabin glowed softly behind them, a beacon of history and hope. The carved box, the crystal, and the journal remained inside, waiting for the next steps, for the next discoveries. But for now, Gideon and Maren stood side by side, knowing that they had faced the trials of the cabin, honored the legacy of those who came before, and stepped into a future filled with possibility. The wind carried a gentle rustle through the trees, a sound that felt like a blessing. The cabin had been tested, and so had they. And though the mountains still held mysteries, shadows, and secrets, the moment was theirs. Gideon finally understood that the journey, the waiting, and the challenges were all part of the story one he would now live fully. With purpose and partnership, Maren smiled at him, her eyes reflecting the stars beginning to pierce the sky. "This is just the beginning," she said. "But it feels like home now, doesn't it?" Gideon looked at the cabin, the mountains, and the vast wilderness surrounding them, and for the first time in his life he felt completely at peace. "It does," he said, his voice steady and sure. "It really does." Together they walked toward the cabin, ready to step inside, ready to continue the legacy, and ready to face whatever mysteries the mountains might still hold. The past had been honored, the present was theirs, and the future, though uncertain, was full of promise. And in the quiet, powerful stillness of the mountains, Gideon realized that he had finally found what he had been searching for all along: a home, a purpose, and a life that mattered. The cabin, now fully awakened and alive with history and memory, stood as a testament to resilience, patience, and the courage to step into the unknown. And in that moment, as stars sparkled above the peaks and the wind whispered gently through the trees, the story of Gideon Cross and Maren Blackthorne became part of the mountains themselves, ready to inspire the next chapter, the next guardian, and the next moment of destiny waiting in the wild. The night was quiet now, full of promise and peace. And for the first time in years, Gideon knew that he had truly arrived home.